It strikes me that there are some real overlaps here. There's something about the value of deconstructing things, the value of taking things apart, the value of understanding the AI behind the AI Barbie and who the stakeholders are in it really comes through. The value of understanding the traditional and modern process of making what is apparently simple, I know it's not simple, artifact like gold thread. The value of understanding the complexity behind passporting systems as exposed by their forgery. And I wonder whether this is a question to all of you really, whether you can identify in the areas of concerns that you each have elements which are strongly related to some of those principles that are exposed by the deconstruction, the decomposition that you've heard the other two speaking about. I mean, it strikes me there's an obvious relationship between passports and AI because they're highly technologized. But if I could ask you to respond to that in respect to the relationship between your talks. Who would like to go first?
There were fantastic parallels. I thoroughly enjoyed both your talks. I thought it's really nice to hear someone speaking your language. I would pick up on something that Mahmoud said, which is about articulating an articulatory practice, I guess, that not a problem to be solved, but I can't remember how you phrased it, but decisions to be made by the designer. Forgive me if I'm butchering your ideas. And I think for us, perhaps it's a case of not being blinkered to the full context, the full site that a designer operates in, and not allowing some of those things to be obscured. So, for instance, the rhetoric of technology is cloud and air. It's this immaterial stuff, right? So that obscures the mines, the enormous factories, the fantastic physical infrastructure of shipping, the incredible weight of the tech industry, the servers. So I think that as an example, to try and understand the full scope would actually enable designers who are really smart, really innovative, really creative people who do great jobs at solving the problems they're given, to understand that that's not actually the task at hand. What they're trying to solve is not the task at hand. I think is a key thing that I drew from the other talks.
Sure. I think it was very nice parallels. I don't know how intentional that was. Hopefully it was. But I think that one of the things I think is interesting is that the practice of both deconstructing the thing and then looking at the ethics of the whole process. And I think that's something that's a parallel. In our work, we're looking. So, for example, in this exhibition, we do the glass room. One of the pieces in there, and to give an example, is we made a replica of Mark Zuckerberg's house and the 4 houses he bought around his for $40 million in the same year that he said that the age of privacy is over. And so we're trying to use the language to look at its ethics on many, many levels, including those of people who lead the industry, which I think is very similar in Kate's work as well, right the way down to trying to deconstruct and make objects which interact with that. So I think that's kind of interesting, and there's a little bit in Mahmoud's work too. So I think that I wonder if there's more and more designers working in this way, both theory and practice at the same time, and critique, and then using that to put forward objects rather than just text, for example. And whether those can be found more across disciplines, which I find really interesting. And that's why I raised at the very end that point about the work we do on detox, for example, for users. You can imagine the same kind of alternative in the fashion industry for saying, like, how do you buy clothes? How do you consume them? Like, engaging with people where they are at as well as individuals could be an interesting extension of all of that work.
Yeah, sure, quickly. Yeah, of course, there are interesting parallels. One of the things I want to mention is that, I mean, you use the term deconstruction, and I mean, one of the things I'm trying to get at here is this Western notion of authenticity, right? That presumes there is a truth that then needs to be deconstructed in a critical sense. What I'm trying to get at that, you know, forgers, you know, don't care about that, right? They don't care about the truth because it doesn't exist as such. So here what I'm trying to say that the act in itself from the beginning is a deconstructive act. It's not that something exists and I'm going to from the beginning there is no belief that there is a truth that needs to be deconstructed, but that, you know, identity is only produced through reproduction, right? So sometimes I'm amazed in design schools or design briefs, right? You get this kind of iconic design to redesign it, right? Because you recognize that, you know, Clive Dillon always makes this point about these 100 chairs, right? That each of them is a configuration of the ways in which one can inhabit, you know, and sit. And you constantly redesign this, and it's imperative that you recognize that's the ontological condition of design, remaking things, because it's materially made, thus can be unmade and remade. But when it comes to certain other made things in the world, it seems that we are paralyzed, right? Passport, borders, you know, these kind of concepts, what happens that they displace themselves from this realm of materiality, this realm of constant making and remaking, to a realm that they are untouchable because we wrongly assume that it's just a policy or it's a politics happening in the parliament and the material is just an instrument applying that policy. So my point here is again recognizing the kind of struggles and that those people who are actually subject to the very materiality of these things, they already do that not from any kind of position of enlightenment, you know, position of critical practice as this kind of distance practice from the field, but because it's a matter of survival. So how to recognize that, you know, it's very important, and not again kind of reframe it within the ways in which those discourses like enlightenment discourse and so on that actually are the producer of these notions of authenticity and identity. So
thank you. The Uber drivers are the closest that your two sets of examples get to. Can I see any? We've got a couple of questions up here. A blue arm and a grey jacket. Sorry, that's all I can see. My eyesight isn't very good.
Thank you. Grey jacket speaking. I'd just like to link it to the first panel this morning. So we've just had Facebook criticised for not thinking about the consequences of what they were doing before they did it, and having a kind of Pollyanna-ish attitude as to what tech might be for. But this morning, the panelists were kind of arguing for a freedom in not having to think too carefully about what they were doing before they did it in terms of social engagement work. And the research ethics scrutiny process of universities was criticised. I'm just wondering if there's an inconsistency there, because that research ethics process exists to enable researchers to be clear about their method and intention before they do something. It's not just about policing or managing risk. It's an instrument to actually strengthen intention and method so that we think a bit more carefully about what we're going to do, with whom and how and why, before we do it. So I'd just like to throw that out and see if there's any response, please.
Would any of you like to respond?
I can just say quickly that I think, in my view, one of the big differences is like scale. I mean, Facebook tests things on 2 to 3 billion people. That's quite a different process than trying something out in a library. I'm not saying it's not important to do it properly, but it is quite a different thing. And then at the same time, I think that when you engage with those technology companies, interestingly enough, they don't have the rigor that universities have. When at Google, I asked them how they dealt with ethics. They said, we have lawyers. That's how they deal. This is not the practice that you're talking about. And so, you know, they do need those practices inbuilt into their. And to be fair to some people in the industry, they are trying to make that happen, but it's, you know, not supported by senior management. But they do need those ethical processes in place that they don't have actually. And one of the frustrating things I've noticed with people, I know somebody who does medical testing, and what she found is that her testing has to go through all these mechanisms, but the apps that basically collect the same information and actually sell it to the same industries and the same pharmaceutical companies, for example menstruation apps, don't have to go through any of that rigor whatsoever. So there's a complete absence of it in the industry itself. Yeah.
I think I would just say that I think it's interesting. We in terms of how designers are operating and want to be operating with a kind of agility and a freedom, which maybe is something that you're suggesting. I didn't see the panel this morning. I think that works if we're not operating in ignorance. Right. If we're operating with the full knowledge of a complexity and shifting complexity that isn't, there is no absolute right or wrong, but a shifting complexity, then the act of design becomes a free act, but it's within the full context of the issue at stake, right? And I think then it can be more of a martial art in a way, right? You're dealing with contingencies, but you've got the full scope and you've got the skills to do it, and sometimes you're going to get knocked on your ass. But I think at the moment, those structures are in place because we're ignorant to a lot of these things. So they need to be kind of hard structures. But I think there's a possibility with technology actually to enable us to kind of viscerally understand the complexity of the situation. Almost at our fingertips, in a way that we can bring complexity to us through technology actually, which will allow us to operate in it, not in a blunt way, but in a kind of slightly more kind of Jackie Chan way.
Yeah, quickly. I do agree that these ethical guidelines develop, at least from the context I come from in Sweden. I mean, it has of course a history. Swedish anthropologists and medical researchers were involved in Nazi experiments. So, and I mean, it's very important, for example, there but they come from specific medical experiments. So if you work as a designer or researchers, many times when you look at this form, you cannot really feel it because it doesn't apply to design work. But another part of it is these type of forms, the problem that they produce that often might make the researcher reserve the ethics only to this. So I'm done with the ethics. I don't need to think anymore, how I'm going to engage with these people, this situation. And, what I'm trying to say that ethics, rely on that situation, both in the ways in which what forces already exist, what kind of potential is there, how I relate to that, what my body does there, and all these things. I mean, for example, in Sweden, if you deal with the situations outside of Sweden, you don't need to fill the ethical form. So basically, you live your ethics beyond the borders of Sweden, right? So, which is, tells a lot about these institutional practices because they just care within, that limited space. It might be helpful, but it's so limited. And, again, to not reserve your ethical engagement just to that form.
Thank you, Mahmoud. So, a question from this person here, and then there's one more question as well after this, closer to me, and then I think we shall finish for lunch.
Is also for Mahmoud.
Sorry, we can't hear you. There's a problem with the microphone.
Is this better?
Yep, that's good.
So this is also for Mahmoud. Thank you for your presentation and the use of theoretical framework. Have you considered how can mobilizing of criminal design influence social change, like clandestine design group in Brisbane does, or Craig Martin in Edinburgh College of Arts calls it informal design. So how can mainstream designers utilize and learn from practices whose point is to be invisible? Thank you.
Yes. I would be hesitant to use this type of terms, criminal design, because to me the passport that government produces is a criminal design. So again, when I talked to some of the forgers, they always pose this question, right? They told me, you are allowed to use the term smuggler to describe me as long as you say the state is the bigger smuggler, right? As long as you say state is the main criminal, because they are the one at the first place produce the borders, which requires the market for us to operate. So many of them are reflective on that position. So I would be hesitant to reserve a category like criminal design as if, it's again reinforcing this narrative of criminality to often racialize bodies, I would say, that again, what forges remind us is that the passport in itself, is a crime in terms of faking identity. If government calls me Swedish by giving me this passport, I mean, they don't trust me as a Swedish all the time, right? So many times when I cross the border, they ask me questions in Swedish to be sure that, I'm not using a forged passport because I haven't got the body that, fits, the international regimes of who is a Swedish person. So even the government doesn't trust what they themselves produce, right? So forgers, in a way, reveal that masterfully. So in that sense that they basically, what I'm trying to say, actually to decriminalize, what they have been for a long, and kind of saying that the act of designing, the ways in which, governments, states, technologists and lobbyists are involved in producing borders and mechanisms to enforce those borders are actually the bigger crimes here. So my intention is something else here, to redirect this towards the source of production, that is the law and the state. So.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Yeah. And so we have one more question nearer to me. This person here. Yeah. Past the microphone's coming.
Hello, thanks so much for this. I was attracted to the claim that design already contains ethical implications, and I thought that the talks worked extremely well together in that they suggested a horizontal and vertical axis alongside this can happen. So there's the history of material and practices which adapt, but then there's the geography and how thinking of design as spatially extended also suggests a kind of continuity that makes being ignorant much more difficult, right? This all adds up to a kind of a field where ignorance is not an excuse. So working with this view of immanent ethics to design, how far would you say that design practices can serve value articulation from within? Standards of value as articulated through design practices, so ethics rather than being externally imposed, something that is a product of deliberation, public value, however you want to call it, right?
Is that the question? Yeah, sure.
Which of you would like to take that one? Would you have somebody in mind to answer particularly?
Mahmoud was shaking his head, so...
So perhaps Mahmoud again, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you put it nicely, so I just wrote down some of the terms you use. I might borrow that. But, well, I think first and foremost, we have to here rethink, this whole, the idea of design. So if when I say, it's this, as you said, the immanent. It's already contains this. I don't necessarily only refer to the institutional and professional definition of design, right? So I refer to the ways in which different people, if they're called designer, if they see designers or not, they engage with the materiality of the world, remake it, in different directions from which history imposes, from which the politics imposes. So in that sense, for me, recognizing the ways in which people actually come with this cunning knowledge, I think Lucy Kimball in the book as a chapter on this, metis and cunning knowledge, and how basically this type of knowledge that often get ignored, bring up these ethical aspects more than the ways in which, the institution asks you to add, or, a philosopher of ethics has a set of principles to tell you to do it. Why? Because those people in that situation constantly deal with contingency, complexities that cannot be seen, before, cannot be overseen. And in this sense, so first step, it's when you deal with this, those conditions in which that the materialities produce certain politics, first you need to recognize, as I said, the forces that are there, that actually are there because of those materials, right? So in the book I developed this concept of passport situations to discuss about the situations in which passports make sense, are important, but also produce oppression and violence. But also about the situations that passport may give rise to, forgery and so on and so forth. So that's why ethics of situation, I think Clive Dillnod has written about this in the book Design and the Question of History, that it's a way to think of this. And again, it's about different bodies and the materials that involve in different situations that are not identical, right? That's the whole idea of metis, right? That's not a universal approach. You cannot know it then beforehand. You have to be engaged with it to understand it. And again, not just to get into a situation, but recognize who already are engaging with it. So,
thank you. Do you have anything to add to this point?
Okay, do you want to say?
I wanted to. I'm not sure if it's completely answering the question, but I wanted to talk maybe a little bit about values. And you're talking about the value system, maybe of a company or an organisation being a kind of top-down thing. And I think it's very accepted that in a lot of places that designers come in as kind of vacant bodies that assume the values of an organisation, and that it's not really necessarily acceptable to bring your own values into a meeting. And I think that's something that needs to be changed, and that's something that also to understand the full scope of various value systems and how they are in conflict with each other, not just the financial value. Obviously, we touched on the cultural value, the environmental value, so that those things can somehow get their own metric that can be used in parallel with the financial value system. But I think that's also something that when it's natural that a group of people together in a room bring their own values together to that meeting, and that's a discussion that comes up and bubbles to the surface, and it has to be some kind of a negotiation. Then when that's a little bit more accepted, then I think we won't leave our values at the door, which is something that happens a lot.
I can just say very quickly, just to add to that, I'm going to say something optimistic, which might be surprising after you've seen what I've talked about. But I think I would say that my optimistic thing is to say the work I've done with designers working in big tech companies and small tech companies has shown me that they're really engaged in these issues, really well read, really concerned about them. They're just completely lost, in my view. I think they do have good, well, not all of them, but certainly the ones I've worked with have been really positively reinforced, like these questions of values and of the concerns they might have. What they don't know is how to resist or how to change, and I think that's where the work needs to be done.
Thank you very much indeed.